Well, very warm welcome to all of you that are joining us already. My name's Matthew Weldon. I'm going to be presenting today. I'm going to be the host for the session as well. I'm delighted to be joined by Matt Hayes, who's Managing Director for Technology from Sage, and Samantha Sharman, who is a student at the University of Lincoln. We're going to wait just a minute before getting started today. Wait for a few more people to join us, and then we'll get underway. The session is being recorded today, and the recording will be available as of next week. So if you had any colleagues who were interested but weren't able to attend on the date, you'll be able to share it with them. Please do. I've also got a link up on the screen at the moment and a QR code to let you download Librarian Futures Part 2, our most recent instalment in the Librarian Futures series of reports. So if you haven't read it, there's still going to be a lot for you to take away from today, and we'll be happy to answer any of your questions. But you can download that and read it later. So that's there for you as well. But as I said, we'll wait just a moment before we get underway. Okay, I can see we've still got some people joining us, but I think we'll get underway with the session today. So welcome, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to be joined by so many of you. This session is called The Knowledge Gap Between Librarians and Students, and it's focusing on the second instalment in our Librarian Futures series of reports. As I mentioned just a moment ago, don't worry if you haven't read that, there's still going to be plenty for you to take away from the session today, and we will be very happy to answer any of your questions as we go. I'm joined, as I said, by Matt Hayes, Managing Director from Technology from Sage, and Samantha Sharman, who's a student at the University of Lincoln. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. As I mentioned, the session will be recorded, so you can share it afterwards. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A box or the chat feature as well. We'll be very happy to take your questions and answer them at the end of the session today as well. I'll be starting off by talking about the key findings from part 2 of Librarian Futures. Then we'll be hearing from Sam, who'll be sharing a bit more about the student perspective. And finally, Matt will be telling us about our vision here at Technology from Sage, about the future of the academic library. Matt, Sam, I don't know if you want to just quickly introduce yourselves just now before we get started.
Sam, should I jump in? Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Hayes. I'm Managing Director of Technology from Sage. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for joining us. My background is I've been at Technology from Sage for 3 years, having worked initially on the Lean Library side and then taking on the Sidewell and Tallis parts of Technology from Sage as well, which we'll talk about later on. And prior to that, I was at Clarivate and Taylor & Francis. I have a PhD in global citizenship education, and I'm passionate about the library and all that we're doing at Technology from Sage, but we'll speak more about that later.
Thanks, Matt. And Sam?
Hi, so I am Sam Sharman. I am, as of 2 weeks ago, a graduate from the University of Lincoln. I majored in classical studies. Whilst at Lincoln, I was involved in a couple of research projects, all about library services, digital education, so quite a varied experience of student engagement with digital reading and all that fun stuff.
Thanks very much, Sam. And Sam also crucially contributed some of the data that we used when writing Librarian Futures Part 2. So we're really grateful to be joined by you today, Sam, and looking forward to hearing about the, I say student perspective, like you say, the graduate perspective. So apologies for getting that wrong there. I'm a library patron consultant here at Technology from Sage. And really, it's my role here to work with libraries and librarians to understand exactly how we can work together to make sure your students are successful. So let's get underway. I will be starting off by talking about the key findings from the Librarian Futures report. I should also mention that I, in large part, wrote the second part of the Librarian Futures series, which is why I'm talking to you today. And I wanted to start off really by giving a little bit of context about the background of the report and why we decided to write part 2. Part one of the Librarians Future report came out at the end of 2021. Its title was Charting Librarian Patron Behaviours and Relationships in the Networked Digital Age. And really it focused on the library in the life of the user. You can see there's a vast range of data that we pulled from to construct Librarian Futures Part 1. But what really struck us, I think, at Technology from Sage in the first report was the bi-directional knowledge gap that we identified between librarians and their patrons, where librarians were in large part unaware of the emerging needs of their patrons, and so weren't providing the solutions to the problems that their patrons were identifying. And patrons also were in large part unaware of the different services that their library could offer to them. So we wanted to delve a little bit deeper into that knowledge gap to identify those areas of where there wasn't quite an understanding and provide hopefully useful information for libraries to implement solutions for those. And that's what led to Futures Part 2. This one subtitled The Knowledge Gap Between Librarians and Students. And really it focused, like I say, on contrasting the librarian and the student perspectives, specifically on the undergraduate workflow. As I mentioned, we drew on some of the research from Sam, as well as Matt East that they did in collaboration. We also drew on information from a survey of about 600 students in the UK, the US and Canada. And if you missed it at the very beginning, as you were joining the call, we've got the link there on screen and a QR code so that you can download that report if you haven't yet read it. But we will go through the key findings of the report at the moment, starting off with discovery. So we wanted to understand a little bit more about how students are doing or beginning their research. What we found in Librarian Futures Part 1 was that the vast majority of students were starting their discovery process outside of the academic library. And I don't think the data on the right-hand side of the screen there will come as much of a surprise to many of you on the call today. What we found is that the most popular method of research for finding resources for assignments and studies is Google. 63% of students said that they Google stuff at some point during their journey. But we didn't want to just understand necessarily all the different ways that people are using. We also wanted to understand how they were beginning that search. And what we found in that regard as well is that Google is also the most popular starting point. A plurality of students begin all of their research with Google. And then drilling into a little bit more about where the library sits in that, we found that about a third of students do use the library website at some point of their research, but very few of those students begin their research process with the library website. About 10% of students begin there. And around 1 in 4 students use the library building at some point of their research process. And that number shrinks to a relatively small 5% of students beginning in the library building. So those are quite stark results, but I don't think, as I mentioned, I don't think they'll come as much of a surprise to many of you on the call. What I wanted to emphasize though is that it's not all doom and gloom. Most students do see a place for the library in supporting their studies. They do think the librarian has a role to play. But what's perhaps slightly more concerning is that many of those students really see the library as a building and a collection and not an awful lot more. Now, in part 1, when we asked librarians to what extent they agreed with this statement from Evans and Schoenfeld, the mission of the library is not about the building and collections, but who librarians serve. When we asked librarians to what extent they agreed with that, about 75% of them said that they agreed with this statement or strongly agreed with this statement. So clearly there's a bit of a mismatch there between how librarians think about themselves and about the library and how students see it. So having understood a little bit more about how students are doing their research, how they're beginning that research as well, we then wanted to understand a little bit more about how prepared students are to engage with information once they've found it. So we asked them some questions, for example, how confident are you today in each of the following areas? And then we gave them a number of categories to choose from. The data that we see here on the right-hand side specifically pertains to their confidence in reading academic literature. And you can see there's a good kind of variety of responses there. About 27% of students reported being very confident in reading academic literature, but most students said that they were mostly confident, and quite a sizable number of students said that they were somewhat confident, and there were even some who said that they were not confident with reading academic literature at all. So clearly, even though some students don't feel they have any work to do, there are a lot of students who would benefit from intervention in that regard. And I would stress as well that the results that we saw were broadly similar when we asked students about their confidence with digital skills or course-related work as well. We saw broadly the same results here. However, most students don't actually see librarians as providing them any help. And I'll ask you to just bear this next statistic in mind. Just 25% of students reported that librarians helped them in getting access to resources. And also a smaller number of students reported that librarians helped them in finding specifically good information. And I'll ask you, like I say, to bear that in mind for a few slides' time, because I think that's important context for another slide that we'll look at. But clearly there are areas that students need more support, but they are not identifying librarians as the people to help them with that. And I wanted to put this information in here as well, just to stress that we were seeing differences between groups of students as well. So there were significant differences between first-generation students in their regards to their confidence in academic reading, digital skills, or course-related work with non-first generation students. Non-first generation students were reporting that they were very confident, significantly more than first generation students were when it came to all three of those. And in turn, first generation students were identifying as somewhat confident, significantly more than the non-first generation students. So I wanted to put that in there, as well as the point in the bottom about similar differences between full and part-time students and early and later year students, because I think it's really important to understand that different, students aren't a block, and I think we're all very aware of that, but different groups of students are having broadly different experiences at university. They are having experiences that aren't necessarily equitable, and I think there's a real role for the library to play in addressing those inequities. So I asked you to keep that statistic a moment ago in mind. We asked students who, if anyone, has helped you grow across the following areas, and we gave them a bunch of different areas: identifying a good research question, working in a digital environment, reading academic literature, thinking critically about the subject, writing at university level, a bunch of different stages of the research and assignment writing process. And what we found across every single one of these is that students reported or responded me, my peers, or my teachers more than they responded my librarians. Librarians across every single one of these categories was ranked 4th. And the most successful category for librarians among all of that was in getting access to resources, which, as I said, just 25% of students reported that librarians were helping them get access to resources. Now, for me, I think getting access to resources, of course, is something that librarians are uniquely well placed to help with, but librarians have a role to play across all of these. And students simply were identifying that they either weren't approaching their librarians for support or weren't being offered it. I think more likely that students weren't aware that that support was there for them. So having looked into a little bit about student literacy and their confidence in regards to the research process and the writing process, wanted to understand if students were making use of any extracurricular training or education that was available to them. And you can see along the right-hand side here, we asked what kinds of additional workshops or other training that the university offers besides, the core classroom material were students making use of. And what we see across all of them is relatively small uptake, the most popular one being study skills, with just 34% of students making use of study skills training. And a quarter of all students saying that they don't participate in any training at all, any extracurricular training at all. We also, again, across all of these, found significant differences between full-time and part-time students. And part-time students were reported significantly more uptake of this additional training than full-time students did. I think it's interesting to consider the possible reasons behind that. it could be, I think, that part-time students are possibly more pressed for time, possibly, have to maybe fit it in the evenings or on days off, but are possibly also trying to make better use of that time, make sure that time is more effectively spent. So it's possible that that is one of the driving factors there. Or it could be that part-time students are being better targeted by the library. It's one of these things that is worth considering the reasons behind it. And I'd be very interested actually in hearing the perspectives of some of you on the call today as to why you think it might be and how we might sort of start to redress that balance. And we also wanted to understand how difficult students found several aspects of preparing assignments. So we asked them across making notes and annotating sources, finding relevant resources, managing their time. And you can see, again, there's a good variation of responses here. But even in cases like finding relevant resources, although the majority of students say that they find it easy, it's a slim majority, which leaves many students who still feel perhaps ill-prepared to do this or don't find it easy at all. So there are plenty of areas across which librarians could intervene and bring their sort of unique insight and their talents to bear on that and sort of go towards addressing that kind of, addressing the lack of confidence or the difficulties that they have there. The area where students reported having the most difficulty was managing their time and keeping focused on the task at hand. So again, that's useful, I think, for librarians to consider which areas they can best target, understanding a little bit more about where students really feel that they are struggling. A really important point, we've mentioned the differences between first generation and non-first generation students or full-time and part-time students. Really important to note as well that across many of these categories, students who identify as disabled reported greater levels of difficulty, again highlighting an important disparity and that students are not necessarily having an equitable experience at university. So I think that's something that's really important to bear in mind when we're considering how we sort of look to redress these imbalances in future. And having sort of looked at that, I wanted to touch upon a few points of interest, I think, for librarians and for any staff at universities when it comes to teaching. Students overwhelmingly identified as independent learners when we asked them to place themselves on a spectrum rather than collaborative learners. And what's interesting is that we didn't observe any significant differences between students who started their university experience in person or students who started their university experience mostly online. I think there might be a slight temptation to look at that and go, well, of course, most students are independent learners. They've had to deal with COVID. They've been perhaps isolated from their colleagues for long bouts of time. But actually, we didn't observe any significant differences between groups of students. But what I think is really interesting about that is a couple of slides ago, we talked about the fact that students were more likely to identify their peers as having helped them than librarians. So it might just be an issue of students not recognizing the fact that they're actually collaborative in nature. You might not necessarily twig that, talking with their friends is a formal collaboration, but for our purposes, I think essentially it is. If they're helping each other to learn, if they're co-constructing knowledge, then it is collaboration. So it's interesting to see the slight disconnect between those two data points that we've gathered there. And again, I don't want everything here to seem quite doom and gloom. So I think it's really important to stress that broadly students reported being very satisfied with their academic experience. So a lot is going right here and students are broadly having a good time. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no work for us to do, that there's nothing that we can work together on to help with. And we're getting towards the end of my bit now, so I'll stop talking in just a couple of minutes. I wanted to draw attention here to the fact that there's a roughly even split between students who will spend less than 15 minutes looking for a resource, 15 to 30 minutes looking for a resource, and 30 to 60 minutes looking for a resource. So they're roughly evenly split. And this is, of course, an area where librarians are, again, uniquely placed to intervene, to help, and to help them find good quality resources quickly. But only 25% of students reported receiving that help from librarians, and just 16% of librarians, 16% said that librarians had helped them find good information. So again, it's worth considering whether that's because students just aren't aware that that support is available to them. Does the library need to perhaps develop our abilities to sort of reach out to students, make them aware that the library is there? Or does the library need to sort of assert themselves earlier in the students' journey, make students more aware of the fact that the library is there? So again, I'm sure all of you on this call will have lots of really interesting perspectives on that and really interesting insights to share. So I look forward to hearing some of them later on. And just a few final points to run through. I thought I'd share this just because it might be of particular interest to you on the call. Just 12% of the students we surveyed identified having taken part in any form of extracurricular training on information literacy. And I think, sorry, I couldn't make it the whole way through a talk in 2023 without talking about ChatGPT. I think in the era of ChatGPT, though, information literacy is something that we're going to have to get better at talking about, that students are going to have to, really engage with, and that we vendors and you as librarians are going to have to contend with. So I thought that was really interesting and something for us all to sort of think about as we consider what additional training to offer in future. Our research also consistently found, as I've mentioned quite a few times, significant differences between first generation and non-first generation students. So it's worth considering how we might intervene to better address the needs of those first generation students and make sure that everyone has an equitable experience at university. On that point, students who identify as having a disability are less likely to visit the library in person than those without. And I think it's really important that we sort of consider why that might be and what steps we can take to make sure that disabled students are as welcome in the library and feel as welcome in the library as students who don't identify as disabled. And more generally, what steps can the library take to ensure that there's equity of outcome and equity of experience as far as possible for all students? We've mentioned the differences across multiple different categories. So what can we do to make sure that everyone has an equitable experience at university? And I'm going to leave you with a quote from Ian Snowley that he kindly provided after reading through some of this data. He said that post-COVID, they have noticed that, post-COVID, they've noticed that students are less comfortable using an academic library and harder to reach and engage with. This is sobering news for academic librarians, and I'd be interested to know if you can relate to that, as all of you work immensely hard in organising and promoting support to help all students achieve their potential. So for me, it means we need to redouble our efforts and find novel ways to reach students and open their eyes to the difference that we can make. I think that that's something that's very important to us here at Technology from Sage. We absolutely believe in the academic library and academic librarians about your role in helping students sort of navigate the higher education landscape. And of course, many of those will be doing it as we've said, first generation students, they will be having an entirely new experience. We think the library has a really important role to play in that. And I think we're very excited as we look to the future, and we very much have the academic library as a North Star. We're very excited to sort of work with you on that. But I'll let Matt talk a little bit more about that later on. And that's me. That's my bit. And now I'm delighted to pass over to Samantha Sharman, who, recent graduate of the University of Lincoln, is going to give us the student's perspective on some of the data I've just provided. And we're really grateful to Sam for taking the time and for sharing her perspectives on this as well. Thanks, Sam.
Right, thanks for having me. So yeah, as Matthew said, I'm here to provide a little bit more insight into the student perspective and student attitudes regarding the library, its resources and its services. I'm always amazed when I speak at events like these or get involved in workshops and people tell me afterwards that it was really great or refreshing to hear directly from a student. And they often say, oh, it doesn't happen often. We don't often speak directly to students. To me, the student perspective is an incredibly important aspect of all elements of higher education, but particularly in areas where student support and development are concerned. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this part of the presentation, it's that speaking and engaging with the students directly is an incredibly useful tool. So especially when librarians are asking questions about how to increase student engagement, how to enhance outreach and meet student needs, clarity on these aspects can quite simply and easily be provided by directly speaking to your students. This is why the student perspective is so massively important. Listening to us and directly attempting to understand the realities of how students work and approach their studies can prove immensely valuable when coming up with a strategy for developing library resources and approaches. I'm sure that's not a surprise, but still, I just wanted to reinforce that although I am just a student, there's still a lot of value in what I have to say. Okay, so starting with discovery. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. So bullet point number 1, it often feels like students view the library as a last resort for help. As Matthew was talking about earlier, around 1 in 3 students use the library website, but only 1 in 10 start there. So most often students are going to Google. Many students will often only go to the library if Google or online databases don't prove entirely fruitful. And even then, they're unlikely to actually seek help directly from a librarian. So it sort of feels like there's this subconscious sentiment that, as it's put on the slide, the library is a last resort, and students will only go there if other avenues falter. So linking quite closely with this is the described mentality of, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. This mentality is often read from student behaviour as, I hate to say it, but students can notoriously be quite stubborn and do not necessarily change their ways unless something is very obviously wrong. So take essay feedback, for example. A lot of students will action on that because they've been clearly communicated to about things that are going wrong, things that are going right, and they can action that. However, other skills, such as understanding academic literature and pursuing digital reading, skills that might be seen as more independent, might not necessarily be the focus of student skills developments unless an individual is facing a developed difficulty. So essentially, students won't action and develop their own skills unless there is a problem. Yeah, so naturally there are a lot of questions about where librarians fit into this and can anything be done to support students? And the answer is yes, please help. Early intervention is, a really great tool for helping. So develop support and guidance in the first few weeks of university when students are making the transition to the higher education environment is really great. But if it's complemented by sort of an adaptive approach and meeting students where they are with their workflow, is even better. And then finally, consistency as well is key. So there's this quite common phenomenon when I speak to students and when I've been engaging in the research behind this project. A lot of them mention that there's this info dumping that occurs in the first few weeks of uni, where they get a lot of new onboarding information about everything relating to the university, all the services that they have access to, all the resources, and a lot of the library information they're given is lumped in with all of that. And naturally, they don't remember a lot of it because it's so much and it's a big change all at once. So a lot of information about the library is caught up in this information dump in the first few weeks. But from a student perspective, this means later on down the line, they're not necessarily getting the support and help and guidance that they need because they've essentially forgotten where they've been told they can get that help. So perhaps more reinforcement and promotion directly to students throughout the academic year and across all levels of study as opposed to their first year of study could prove really beneficial. Okay, so on to the next slide, please. So literacy. The first bullet point I will concede is quite bold, but it does reflect something that has come up a lot through all the focus groups and surveys that have gone into this research. A lot of students don't think too deeply about their literacy skills or even realize that it is a skill that can and should be developed and improved like any other skill, which really, creates the question of how can students enhance and develop their skills if they're unaware of key areas such as digital reading or engaging with academic literature. So showing them that reading itself is as important a skill as writing and researching and everything else that goes into being a student at university is one way that librarians could really support students, I think, and enhance their development of their literacy skills. From my own personal experience and from additional experience in these research projects, I know one area of literacy that a lot of students are uncomfortable with is the general premise of skim reading and how to get through texts a little bit quicker and get information out of them from just glossing over, and also understanding academic jargon in journals and such. So any support for that would also prove really useful, as it is a common area that comes up a fair bit. But again, as Matthew was mentioning earlier, a lot of students don't necessarily go to librarians for help. Instead, it comes up quite a lot in the focus groups that students are learning through almost trial and error, which is taking them a long time to develop skills as they're working through them over time and improving gradually, as opposed to, you know, a quicker process. So although it's great that students are adopting this approach because it's fostering their independence and they're going to be independent learners, there are definitely aspects within this that librarians could help support and could enhance the development of student skill sets. So areas like information literacy and understanding academic literature, all areas that librarians could sort of act as a catalyst for that skill change. Yeah, so leading from this as well, it is quite clear that students often don't make the connection between the library as being a place for skills development. And so they're missing out on so many amazing opportunities for them. So it really begs the question of, how do you get students to understand that librarians can help with more than finding books? I mean, that's a really big question from today, but definitely from the student perspective, that is something that needs to be approached and tackled. And on to the next slide, scaffolding. Scaffolding, again, is a really hot topic. And I think the key here is to understand the student workload and to, where possible, try and adapt to meet the student needs. There are plenty of external factors that impact how students engage with the library. So considering them is absolutely crucial when it comes to scaffolding and structuring library services and support. So again, all of this was touched on by Matthew earlier, so I'm sorry if you feel like I'm repeating some things, but as was discussed before, students are commonly feeling sort of overwhelmed by their workloads as they are faced with a lot of texts to engage with and substantial required prep. It was raised earlier how student engagement in extracurricular activities and training is kind of limited, and it seems natural that students perceiving their workload as being quite a lot to tackle is a factor behind that limited engagement. So it often feels like this is the biggest barrier to students engaging with extra services and resources. Yes, students need to be independent, but considering the workload of the students and perhaps trying to adapt any support services or training session formats to meet this like just student concern would potentially grow engagement but with students in the library services. Also, there are some aspects students just generally mentioned as quite common issues. Matthew again mentioned these earlier, but I do want to reinforce them because they did come up consistently. Students are having a difficult time managing their time and keeping focused, which might not sound directly like a problem for librarians to assist with. However, this feeds into the student workload, with many actually saying that they spend too much time engaging with one resource. So if they have a book that they need to read, they acknowledge that it takes them many more hours than the academics that it probably would take them to actually read through the book. So as a result of this, they are struggling to engage with a lot of materials. So when viewed from this perspective, the library can definitely help students by supporting the development of their literacy skills and other study skills, thus having a just positive impact on the student experience overall. The key here is to let students know that literacy support is not simply just teaching them how to read, but has a plethora of positive effects, such as helping them manage their workload and sort of reducing their sense of being overwhelmed. But yeah, in general, adapting to consider student needs is really important, and a broader consideration of the academic support your library provides is key. So I suppose ask yourselves if the current workshops and sessions tackle any of the questions or issues discussed in the entirety of this presentation, and more importantly, if you were to put yourselves in the shoes of a fresh student, new to university, never studied before at a higher education institution, would you understand the value of the sessions that you're advertising the way they're currently being advertised? Would you understand the value that a student would gain from attending them and engaging with the resources the library currently has? Okay, so that's it for the scaffolding section. So next slide, please. There we go. So engagement. All the areas I've discussed are really interconnected and all feed into one another in terms of how students perceive and engage with the library. And the engagement of students is absolutely no different from that. It's really intertwined with the scaffolding and just the literacy. So actioning on the student perspective in all these other areas sort of will naturally support student engagement in general with the library and its services. But that being said, there are important aspects to consider under this umbrella. So firstly, the promotion of the library and its resources is very significant, and making sure it's done consistently is key. As I mentioned before, currently quite a lot of students are expressing that they're shown library resources, but not necessarily shown how to directly engage with them, or, you know, they're not shown them necessarily beyond their first semester at university. And when I say showing them, I mean having academics show them as well as librarians, like come into seminars or lectures and introduce themselves. So subsequently, because they're not consistently having it reinforced, they are somewhat forgetting what they've been shown, and their engagement is just naturally dropping off a little bit. So reminding students of the library and its services may resolve some of these issues, simply because reinforcing the library's value consistently just naturally reminds students it's actually a place of support and help. It's not just a building. And on the previous slide, I touched on student attitudes and how students feel they spend too much time engaging with a resource and how the library can fit into resolving this problem. I just wanted to reinforce this point, as it is a really prevalent sentiment. As every focus group I've run, it's sort of come up naturally that the students have raised this as something that happens in their process of reading and engaging with resources. So how can the library target this specifically and support students? I already mentioned how literacy and other study skills are areas the library and librarians can perhaps support the development of. This is still a really good question to ask. And then finally, the burning question, why aren't students going to librarians for support? And it is really, can be boiled down to something quite simple, and that students aren't making the connection between librarians and the broader library resources. This can often originate in how the library resources and services are structured or communicated to the students, but it's still an important aspect that needs addressing. I think it would be key if librarians ask themselves, how can I make students more aware of my presence? Because if you make students aware of your presence and your availability, it can help reduce that sort of disconnection that has formed from the student perspective. And okay, onto the next slide, please. There we go. So final remarks. So obviously everything I have said so far, I would really love for you to take on board, but these are sort of the key aspects that I really, really hope you take away with you. So firstly, consistent reinforcement of what the library has to offer is so valuable. Just making sure students are being made aware multiple times a year instead of just one-off info dump sessions at singular points would be really beneficial, just to making them aware that the library is more than just a building. It's got so many amazing resources and opportunities and support, and that librarians are really helpful. So yeah, consistent reinforcement. Additionally, make it clear to students precisely what they stand to gain from the library. Let them know what librarians can help with and what broader support the library has to offer. Try to convey to them the value behind the library in terms that appeal to them, and target their needs and concerns, simply because if you make it clear and direct, the communication aspect, students are going to understand exactly that there is a lot to gain from engaging with the library and librarians and seeking help there. And finally, and most importantly, please speak to your students. Every library is unique and offers different services and support. So although there's a lot that can be taken away from what I've said, obviously, you know, it's still general, just taken from the research that we've done. But by speaking directly to your users through surveys, focus groups, however you choose, You'll get to know clearly what areas your library needs to particularly focus on in terms of considering the student perspective. And it's also it's an immensely effective way to gain insight into what your students want and need. So please just consider getting to know them and speaking to them a bit more in the future. Thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, Sam. That's absolutely fantastic. And as you were talking, lots of questions have come in, but I think what we'll probably do is, Matt, if you want to present your section, and then we'll deal with all the questions at the end. So please, keep the questions coming in. So just clicking a pop-up that's popped up on my screen. Keep your questions coming in, and we will address those in due course. But Matt, if you want to take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Matthew. And thank you, Sam. You really gave life to the evidence and the data background that Matthew's bringing. So a great combination from the two of you. So I just wanted to tie that back to technology from Sage. And so give you a sense of why we care so much about this area. And to do that, let's check that I have control. Or maybe I don't have control there. Matthew, would you mind? Thank you very much. Yes. So I hope you agree with us that we see the findings of this report and its precursor, Librarian Futures Part 1, as a call to action for academic libraries to really go beyond the collection and into those patron services, which of course is a general conversation occurring within the library community at the moment. But we're hoping that we're adding more flesh and more detail onto that with these reports and really trying to give some actionable insight into what libraries can do. And of course, this process is going to be continuous, continue evolution and continued innovation. We know already the last few months some of the dramatic changes that AI has introduced into the student experience and into the faculty workflow as well. And we at Technology from Sage are looking at that at the moment, speaking to our library partners, trying to understand what role the library should play in that as well. So I think what's interesting, and it came up in some of the questions in the Q&A and also in the chat, clearly a lot of the AI developments are just going to exacerbate some of these issues as well. So it's going to make even more important to focus on information literacy. And for us, that's where we see the library can play a leading role. So how does this connect into Technology from Sage? Well, our mission is to help libraries advance teaching, learning, and research. I'm very lucky to be able to speak to a lot of libraries every day in my position, and particularly library directors. And my recurring question to them is, how does what they do collect into the university's strategy? What are the KPIs that they're looking to deliver on as a library? And that's what we're trying to capture here in our mission, because we know that every library at its heart wants to advance the university's mission and therefore wants to advance those pillars of teaching, learning, and research. So we're always looking for ways that we can connect the library into those parts of the university and help the library make their contribution and increase the impact that they have. So in that respect, we hope our mission really lives up to that focus on how the library can go beyond being a building and a collection and into a patron services-led approach. How do we do that? So our strategy there is to amplify the power of the academic library with technology that supports that shift from collection-centric services to patron-centric services. And specifically, our focus is how can we take library services and the collection itself to wherever patrons are, and how can we embed the library in those processes? If you go one more slide, please, Matthew. Thank you. Oh no, I'm sorry. I think I've been clicking too fast. Maybe it's slow down for us. So just quickly, these are our values. So we recognize Technology from Sage as an EdTech division within Sage Publishing. We are one of the smaller players in our space. You know, there's some really big heavyweights in the library technology space. So we pay a lot of attention to how we differentiate. And that includes not just what we do, but how we do it, how we interact with libraries and librarians. So I think our values are particularly relevant in that respect. We believe that the right technology can remove barriers to knowledge. So we really do believe it's not just about the technology itself, it has to serve that end goal of advancing teaching, learning, and research. We believe that librarians are fundamental to learning and research on campus. So we are not looking to disintermediate the library. We're not looking to go directly to the end users, as sometimes can be the trend in education technology. We are firmly committed to the ongoing role of the library, and we want to be one of those businesses that support the library in some of the big shifts that it's already gone through, and that it will continue to go through the growth of things like open access and OER and AI and many other trends besides. We focus a lot on our culture, so both our culture within the team and our culture when we engage with librarians. We want you to feel, if you are part of the Technology from Sage community, that you can connect with other librarians. So we're always looking at ways to improve our user groups and to facilitate those connections between librarians. And finally, we very much believe in openness. So we think that there should be space for lots of actors in the library technology space, but that key to that, to making your job as a librarian easier, is interoperability. So we want to integrate with everybody, and we also want to amplify those emerging technologies, whether they are within Technology from Sage or outside, that need that help from a company like us to embed them in the workflow. We can move on one, please, Matthew. So finally, to connect this into our products, we want to be at the center of what we consider to be a pivotal stakeholder triangle. Matthew's going to have to click quite a bit here. So the first element of that, of course, is the library. The second element of that is faculty, and the third, students. And then if we go on one more, Matthew. So if we look at Thales Aspire, for example, this is our resource list solution from Thales, helping faculty curate and disseminate resources for students. I can show you how this product supports that triangle. So if we look first of all at faculty, I've listed a couple of examples there. There are many more, but the way that Thales Aspire works is it makes it easier for faculty to find resources from within the library and to use them to curate engaging resources for their students. It also enables them to do this embedded in their workflows through our learning management system integrations, and it makes any acquisitions they need for resources the library may not have, and any copyright compliance checks they may need to do, as painless as possible, and many more contributions besides. And then for the student, of course, those resources give much more clarity and coherence on what faculty would like the students to read, whether it's prescribed or recommended, than the absence of such a list. They also give students easy access to resources because we embed those direct links to the authenticated, to the library held content, and it's embedded in their workflow. So it's in the learning management system, or it's on the open web, and we're looking to continue to find ways to get it out into other parts of their workflow as well. And then the library itself, if we go on to the library, you can see how supporting faculty and students with their endeavors also brings that contribution back to the library. It helps promote the library itself and the usage of its resources by surfacing those resources at the point of need for faculty when they're thinking about their resources. So we see increased usage of library resources through this Thales Aspire tool. It also helps the library be copyright compliant, because whenever faculty want to share content, they are able to do that in ways that we enable through our copyright compliance workflows. And finally, it makes the library's life much easier in terms of acquiring resources that faculty may need. So rather than ad hoc queries from faculty, it's all captured in a single system. And of course, much more than that, but hopefully you can see there how the objective is to position the library as a services provider to those two key patrons, faculty and students. Thales Elevate. So again, if we look at Thales Elevate, I'll go through whistle stop tour. This is a collaborative annotation tool for faculty. It reduces their workload, gives them the opportunity to put those annotation tools in the hands of their students and to get collaborative learning taking place from peer to peer to help reduce their workload and also to facilitate student discussion and ultimately to improve student engagement and learning as well, to make it much more rewarding for them to engage in content and to drive that engagement as well. And for the students, it gives them a voice. So they are actively encouraged through this collaborative annotation tool to give their opinions on the resources that have been recommended to them by faculty, and to give those opinions to each other. They can also do that independently, though. They can use this as a tool to support their own independent learning and their own independent note-taking, and it encourages the bringing in of multiple resource types into the learning experience, which I'm sure is going to be even more relevant with some of the new resources we'll see through AI. So it's not just your standard academic article or primary source material. You can also bring in video content and much more. And then why should that be relevant to the library? Well, for the library, it drives usage of their resources, makes it much easier for faculty to get that resource into the hands of students and for it to be engaged and to be a genuine part of the learning experience. We provide analytics so you can track student engagement directly connected to retention, which of course connects up back to those university KPIs. And it helps the library position itself as a key support to institutional efforts in areas like inclusion, because Elevate has these really powerful capabilities of supporting students that have needs around, whether it's to do with the way they engage with the content, or whether it's just to do with their learning preferences. And then if we move on to final two products I want to share with you. So SciWheel is our advanced authoring and reference management tool. So of course, for faculty, as you can imagine, a reference manager is key to the authoring and publishing process. I don't know if you might be able to click. Thanks very much, Matthew. And using a referencing management tool and authoring tool makes it so much easier to publish faster, because you can organize your references in one place and your publishing strategy and get it straight into the submissions process. We also have collaboration models as well. So faculty can work with each other, as is often the case on co-authorship. And we do that through multiple channels. So it's not just a tool that plugs into Microsoft Word or Google Docs. It's also a web app and a browser extension. So we can take these tools anywhere the user needs them. Very similar for the student, but I would just emphasize, going back to some of the points that Sam and Matthew were raising, that this also helps around best practice referencing, information literacy, ensuring they are referencing high quality resources and engaging with the best content for their learning and their research. And then finally, the library, again, the reason why we think this can be so pivotal to the library is because the library is directly providing a service that maybe some users couldn't afford independently, but also that makes it easier for them to provide training and support with a single tool that can answer this, rather than their students and their faculty going off and purchasing tools independently that they then subsequently need library support for. And it helps the library continue to focus on information literacy. And then finally, Lean Library. So Lean Library is our browser extension that embeds the library in Patron workflows. And we do that by integrating with your collection and with your services and creating a knowledge base where we classify all of those services and those collections so that we can bring them into the workflow at the right moment. So when a student, for example, is on Google Scholar, we can say, don't just look at Google Scholar search results, here are the search results from your library's discovery service. And the way that connects faculty, library, and students, well, for faculty, because we're streamlining access to library subscribed content, we're avoiding all of those endless clicks to authenticate. We're able to give you that access straight away, saves faculty time, saves them money where they may be acquiring articles they think the library doesn't have a subscription to, ensures they're using high quality content. So we have integrations with the likes of Cite that allow us to flag retractions and flag any potentially predatory journals and predatory content. And we bring in tools like library chat and library guides directly into the workflow through the browser extension. So if you're on Web of Science, for example, and you're getting a bit confused on how to make the most out of it, the library guide for Web of Science appears directly there rather than you having to go back to the library website. And for students, very much the same approach for them. And then for the library itself, you can see how, because we're supporting faculty and students in their workflow, we're promoting the role of the library. The browser extension is fully branded as the library. We're helping streamline access to library content. In so doing, increasing usage of the library. We see an average 40% growth in usage after a library is integrated Lean Library, and increasing discoverability of library services. So how often do you hear from your patrons that they didn't know that there was a detailed guide about a particular service or a particular part of research on the library website? We're getting that right in front of the patron where and when they need it. So that's it from me. I hope that's helpful, tying it back to Technology from Sage, where you can see why reports like this are so valuable to us. They really help inform our strategy, and I hope very helpful for you too.
Thanks very much, Matt. Much appreciated. And thank you, Sam, as well. We do have a couple of questions come in. I'm aware we've got 5 minutes left, and I'd like to tackle some of those questions. So I think it would be good to run through some of those. The first question that I saw that we came in, I think it's an important one. Did we gather any information on BAME students as part of the report? We didn't. That wasn't part of the demographic data that we gathered as part of the survey. So it's not something that we specifically have data on. But thank you for your question. I think it's an important one. That's something for us to think about as we consider how we do future data collection as well. We also have a couple of questions here. We have a question from not Claire Pike, but Liz Mallet. Liz seems to have logged in with someone else's name, and Jimmy Mitchell, who I think is the only person on this call who's ever been in a musical with me. That's a fun fact, but that's true. I think they are pretty similar, or rather there is some overlap among the questions. So Liz has asked, librarians are aware that we need to reach students where they are, but struggle sometimes to convince academic colleagues to include them in the curriculum at the right time. How do you suggest we do this? And Jimmy has asked, what are some key ways do you think we can get the support from our academic colleagues, helping them to understand that by supporting their librarians with the promotion of their services, this will in turn support them? I think those are both excellent questions with a lot of overlap. Some of my suggestions, just based on the data that we have actually gathered, is that what seems to be particularly powerful for students in terms of getting them to make use of the sort of a vast wealth of extracurricular training that's available through the library are actually endorsements from their staff, which I know isn't exactly helpful when you're trying to convince those staff to endorse it. What I think is particularly powerful for convincing staff to advocate for things is student testimonials, is talking to students and understanding the specific ways that it's helped them. I found whenever I worked for a university that the most effective way to drive change was to point to data from students. And so what I might also suggest, I don't know how it works, I don't know how regular the sort of evaluation is at your university. For us, it used to happen at the end of every course, there would be evaluation. That might be a particularly effective time for librarians to reach out to academics to understand where the course is doing well, where students have suggested that needs some development, and then you can stick your hand up, and say, well, your students have said perhaps that this needs more, but they need more support with the literature review aspect of the course or the assessment. Here is how we specifically can help. So that would be my one of my suggestions. I don't know, Sam, Matt, if you would like to come in on that at all. Sam, on you go.
I mean, to be a bit more pragmatic, the more that the library works with academics, the less work there will be for academics, because I know full well the amount of lecturers who just get bombarded with questions about where do I find X, Y, Z? Why do I need to do this? So if it's made clear to academics that if you actually collaborate with the librarians and let them engage with the students through the workshops and the actual seminars and contact hours, then long term, realistically, they'll probably see a bit of a decline in the asset minded student emails they get, so they could just go to the library instead. It's just less work for academics, really. It's the only way I can think to pitch it.
It's a good way.
Matthew, can I? It's not related to that question directly. It's kind of in parallel. I saw a question from Louise around feedback in the general webinar chat, which I wanted to pick up on.
Absolutely.
And so the question is, how can we actually get more feedback from our patrons when what are the best channels for that? And I just wanted to make a plug there for Lean Library, because what we've created with that is a survey and feedback integration feature, so that the idea being that because it's a browser extension which you download from a web store and it sits in your browser, it allows us to surface whichever survey you choose on any given resource. So we found really good take up of that, because it means that you're asking questions about different parts of the library directly when the patron is actually accessing it. So you can get feedback on, say, a new database you've invested in when the user's on that database, or a new resource that they may be accessing. And of course, also you could just capture them on Google as well. You can even put that on ChatGPT to say, did you know your library has training on how to use AI properly? So I just wanted to make a plug for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Matt. I think Louise, well, I know that Louise and I have worked together in the past on Elevate. So Louise, please feel free to get in touch, and we can work together on that and see what we can set up for you. So I think, just checking time, I think we've pretty much come exactly to time there. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Matt, for joining us today, for your contributions. That's really, really useful, really insightful. And thank you to all of our attendees. It's been fantastic to have so many of you. I'm sorry for any questions that we might have missed, but please do get in touch and we'll be very happy to address those. But yes, thank you all for attending. I hope that the session has been useful for you. I hope you've learned something, and I hope you've got something to take away and mull over. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.